you so much for coming to the 8th and final meeting of the Agricultural Solar Stakeholder Group. You just heard the meetings being recorded. And what I thought we could do is just really quickly review the desired outcomes for the meeting, and then I'll turn to the co-chairs, Selena and Nancy, to see if you have any opening remarks that you'd like to make before we get started. So Eliza's with us. Great. Okay, nice. And hopefully Jeremy and George will join us shortly. Hopefully you all have all of the documents in front of you. The December 12th version of the draft report, the public comments. I'll be referring to the December 10th email that I sent to you, because embedded in it are 8 themes that we sort of drew out of the public comments, but you don't need to look back at that. And the agenda, which is relatively self-explanatory. But really, we have 2 goals here today. One is to fully consider the public comments, see to what extent you'd like to pull forward any thoughts that you gleaned from that document. And then finally, to finalize the wording of the draft document itself, so that by the end of the day, your job is done. Good morning, Jeremy.
Good morning.
And as always, at all meetings, we'll be providing an opportunity for public input. So we'll have that happen in the middle of the day and middle of the morning. And yeah, so questions about the desired outcomes before turning it over to Nancy or Selena for comments. Okay. Any remarks at all that you'd like to make, to either of you?
I'd just like to acknowledge the time and effort that people have put into this work over the last 6-8 months. And I think that we are at a really good place now, and hoping that we can end all feeling good about this process as well, knowing that the work continues. But I just acknowledge the time and effort and I think collaboration that has gone on over the last 8 months, and I really appreciate that. So looking forward to today's discussion to wrap it up.
I would echo that. Thank you very much, all of you, for your time and attention, and I'm excited to bring this to fruition today.
Great, thank you. Well, before digging in, I think as we have sort of customarily done, I just would ask that you turn to page 2 of the agenda to review the ground rules. Sort of draw your attention, since I know you all come fully prepared and you are all engaged really well, for which I'm deeply appreciative, that you can sort of focus in on items 4 through 7, because I think all of those will help you come to a shared understanding that you can all feel good about, and ultimately, ideally, working toward consensus. And to the extent that we raise, any one of you raise issues that others of you are in disagreement with, of just, at least having a curious mind, having an openness to learning and understanding, even if ultimately you arrive at a different perspective. The other thing that I wanted to raise is that, and we talked about one of these things at the last meeting, is as in my experience facilitating many groups, as processes draw to a close and they get to sort of the final moment, a couple of things can happen. And I talked about one of them last time. One of them is, sort of this tendency to look at a document strictly through the lens of one's own constituency, and become highly focused on that, and somewhat lose some sight over the bigger picture of what's trying to be accomplished. So because I am extremely transparent, I'm just going to raise that sort of as a red flag to keep in the back of your mind as you're thinking about items. Does this, number one, serve your constituency? Hopefully it does, but does it also serve the broader interests of the group as a whole? So we just ask that you keep that in mind. The second point, which I didn't talk about last time, and I've seen this over and over, and the way I like to sort of paraphrase it is that it can be difficult to give up your baby after you've spent a lot of time on it. And so there can be this tendency to say, I just want one more chance to look at this. But really the goal here is at the end of the meeting, the process is done, that hopefully over the course of the last 6 or 7 months, you've developed a level of trust and faith in both the co-chairs and in staff, Ethan and Tom, to faithfully interpret what you've provided for input today and pull it into concrete language in the final version. So that's the intent of the process today. And I just wanted to flag those two things since I do see them creep up fairly often. Questions about any of that before we sort of dig into the approach that as a planning team we thought might make sense to take for this meeting? Okay. All right. Well, you basically, hopefully, you're likely going to feel that you're toggling between two documents. And in an ideal world, you'd have either of them printed out or a couple of screens or something where you can be reviewing both, referring back to both the public comments and the draft report itself. The intention is not to go page by page through the public comments because I don't think that would be the most efficient way forward. What we tried to do was capture the major themes that we saw coming out of the body of public comments. What we'd like to do is walk through those major themes and then sort of get your reactions to if any of those themes influence changes that you would like to make and have reflected in the final document. And then also see if there were other themes that we didn't pick up that you feel, you know, were there and just weren't evident to us or didn't raise to the level that they raised for you. As we go through those, to the extent that you want to draw people's attention to a particular page in the public comment document, by all means, please do so. But we thought it may not be the most efficient thing to do to walk through the public comment document page by page. We'll spend about up to half of the meeting focused on that. Again, kind of toggling back and forth. If you want to address a public comment theme, where might it go in the draft document? Where might it be addressed? But ultimately, the second half of the meeting would be focused on the draft document itself, walking through it in a methodical way, just like you did at the last meeting. So section by section and getting your comments. Again, this draft document has, you know, as you saw, lines numbered, so you can hone in on changes that you may like to see on any particular line. How does that process feel? Because this is an iterative thing, and if that approach doesn't feel right to you, totally open to moving in a somewhat different direction. What do you all think? Okay, I'm hearing no major objection. I think we'll go ahead with that. As I said, no need to go back to that original email, but what we do is go point by point through the 8 themes that we identified, and we'll just go from top to bottom. They were not necessarily, they were listed in logical order, but not necessarily priority order from any individual one of your perspectives. The first one was of the 20 comments that were received, 13 of them, or 65%, explicitly advocated for stronger wording or recommendations in support of farmland protection, many noting the need to preserve the state's ability to grow food. So I just wanted to open it up for general reactions to that sentiment. Agree, don't agree, any particular changes that you want to recommend to address that point.
I can start. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important theme. I think it was, as you mentioned, really prevalent within the comments that we received. And I do, you know, have some potential tweaks maybe to address that a little bit, but I don't know if you want me then to save that, wait to hear from others and save that for when we're going through the draft, or talk about that now.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I'm open to what the group would find most helpful. It might be good to hear sort of high-level sentiments from others. And then if there seems to be a theme that we're picking up, if it does, then we can consider coming right back to your specific suggestions. So let's try that and see how that works. Go ahead, Emily.
Judy, I'm agree with Ellen, and coming from farmland protection side, I think that as a group, we were charged with trying to figure out how do we come to consensus around siting on farmland, and I think part of that focus and trying to figure out how we move forward as a group on that. Perhaps, we decided that we're not going to talk about how we site on non-farmland, but perhaps we could have spent more time summarizing and coming to consensus sort of on a general sentiment around how we might feel about how we could prioritize non-farmland, non-green space, sort of in a high level general, and increase our sentiment around that. I don't think we spent a lot of time on that because we really focused on the farmland piece. But I think that there is a space for us to potentially in this draft increase our language, even if it's just some sort of context and high level setting around the prioritization of the built environment and already contaminated lands for siting priority.
Just a clarifying question. Do you two have some specific suggestions when we move over to the draft document or not?
Yeah, not exact language, but some places where I think we can insert some language.
Okay. Maybe show of hands to see to what extent others are in agreement with the general concept. And once we get that, hear from other perspectives that are different than that. Were others felt that way? Yeah, there seemed to be.
I'm not clear what you're asking, Jody.
Sorry. I didn't want to spend time having you all hear from 7 others if all 7 others agree with that point. I just would sort of like a general show of maybe hands, like, yeah, you felt that way too, so that we can get a sense of what degree of the group is leaning in that direction. And then I think it will be important right after that to hear from any perspectives that really are different than that.
Jody, when you say you want to check to make sure if people feel the same or different, can you specify specifically what we're referencing?
So Ellen and Emily seem to share a sentiment that the need for, the importance of farmland protection could be more strongly emphasized in the document, should be more strongly emphasized in the document. I'm trying to get a sense of if that is a general sentiment of the group.
I will say no, I disagree.
Okay.
Without being able to see the language and what we're specifically talking about, I'm in a position of saying, no, I don't agree, but I'm open to seeing and language and learning more about what people are thinking, but on its face without knowing what we're talking about, because to me that sounds like we're can move towards some sort of additional regulation suggestion. That's an area of concern for me, as I'm sure this group is well aware.
Okay. All right, then we won't try that method. So I'm seeing 3 hands up, and I just wanted to see Emily and Ellen first and foremost. Are those comments or just you're supporting that? Yeah, okay, got it. And Eliza, was that true for you as well? Okay. Fortunat, you go ahead.
I think I share Jeremy's concern about sort of moving the sort of the balance that we have tried to strike it in the report. Having said that, I do think there is room somewhere in the introduction or in the to make sure that readers of the report understand that this is about the intersection between solar and ag land, and it does not presuppose that all solar needs to be on ag land, and that in fact most probably should be somewhere else, but that our charge was this. I think that doesn't, it's not exactly the same suggestion as what Emily and Ellen made, but I think some of the comments make me think readers of the report may not understand that context and therefore may think that the conversation is just, all solar is going to be on ag land and how do we deal with it? Whereas
Got it.
Really what we're talking about.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Do people understand Fortunat's suggestion, number one? And do you support that? Thumbs up. Okay, all right. I'm seeing general. Is anybody who doesn't, would you like to make a point or should we move on? Okay.
And I guess, sorry, Jody, I would just encourage whoever ends up with a pen to sort of write it in the affirmative as opposed to in the negative. In other words, the group recognizes there's tons of opportunity for solar in the built environment. And we worked on this stuff around the intersection with ag.
Got it. Yep. Okay. Ethan, do you feel like you have what you need from this exchange?
Yes, although I'm sure once we start going through the report sections, we'll probably come back to it.
Okay, great. Then I'm going to move on to the second theme, unless there's anything else that any of you would like to bring up on this one. Yeah, go ahead, Julia.
When reviewing the public comments, one thing that really struck me was that our entire report and our entire recommendations are based completely on theory. There are no dual use projects in Maine except for the one that just started. We do not know how this is going to look, how this will work in Maine at all, and that is not in any way identified in our report. We do not have any data that is Maine specific. We do not have any examples of this in Maine. This is all just, we think this is how it might work, but that is not clear in the report.
Got it. Okay. Duly noted, duly noted. Then I don't know if you all will then feel that the second bullet, it has been covered by Fortunat's point, but what it was that half of those 13 originally mentioned, half of the 65%, advocated for prioritizing and incentivizing solar siting on non-agricultural land, such as rooftops and parking lots. Now, I'm not suggesting that Fortunat's suggestion was to incentivize that necessarily. We did not get to that point, but to at least acknowledge that those opportunities exist. And so just reactions to that subset of public comments and anything that you'd like to see captured in the report as a result of it. Go ahead, Ellen.
Yeah, I think that is a really important point. And I think Fortunat's suggestion, I think, is great as a way of addressing it. I think it would also be great, though, to mention in the report that there were, though, some of us at least interested in thinking through how we could greater facilitate solar development on sort of previously developed or degraded land, but it was sort of, made clear that that was under the purview of another stakeholder group. But I think it's just really important to note that there at least was interest among some of us in sort of thinking through how we could really support solar development on, previously developed and degraded lands.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I should probably say that when the planning team, when Nancy, Selena, Ethan, Tom, and I met yesterday, the day before, to just sort of plan through this meeting, we noted sort of hopefully the obvious, that because this report is so thorough, such a thorough documentation of what you covered in the initial sections of the document before it gets to recommendations, it follows that there should be a small section that summarizes the public comments as well, and that that would be an addition to the document that simply states, here's what we heard. and that would be another place to reflect that that issue arose. Other thoughts on that second point? Again, I'll just read it so you're not having to refer back to the email. Half of those 13 specifically advocate prioritizing or incentivizing solar siting on non-agricultural land, such as rooftops and parking lots.
Just quickly want to echo support for Ellen's idea of making it clear that that was something of strong interest for many members of this group. And I'm reviewing the recommendations again. I'm trying to think if there's a way to incorporate that in some way as well. But I would like to see that included in the report as well.
Thank you. Emily?
Yeah, I think that this relates to what I mentioned before, and that the protection of farmland and production is really the other side of the coin of also advocating for siting on the built environment and contaminated lands. And so I think that that's where we, defined what we were actually going to focus on in this group, and we focused on one side. And so I think that really clearly putting out some of the explanation in our process of why we focused on this, and including that we believe that there's, well, if we come to consensus, we believe that there's great opportunity in all of the built environment and rooftops and other settings, but we focused on this piece will help clarify and perhaps have the readers understand really why we're so narrowly focused.
Got it. Okay. Jeremy, do you have you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I'm going to apologize in advance because I think you all have probably heard me say these things 3, 4, and 5 times, but I feel compelled to say this again. The reason we're not seeing as much development on rooftops and previously contaminated sites is because of the cost associated with that and/or the proximity of necessary infrastructure. So I think it is misleading to a potential reader who would not have the ability to consume all of the information that we have been digesting over these last number of months, and just like, oh, okay, well, let's stop doing agricultural land. We can do it in all these other places. It is extremely challenging politically, as I've said before, to secure political support for greenfield development, which is the cheapest type of solar that exists in Maine today, by and large. There are clearly some exceptions. But if a reader reads this report and says, okay, well, we're going to stop doing it in farmland, we're just going to do it in rooftops and parking lots and carports, and that's going to be easy and we're all done, that doesn't even tell half the story. It tells about 1/10 of the story. There needs to be some context provided as to why that's not happening. Or we need to be extremely blunt and say, if we are going to encourage and induce this type of development, there is a literal cost to doing that. And I know some people have said, well, it doesn't have to be an incentive or ratepayer subsidy. Maybe it can be some sort of permitting process where we streamline it, but we haven't really dug into that either. So if that's where we're going to push the message in this report, there needs to be a lot more context.
Thanks. Yep. Ellen?
Yeah, well, I would just say, there's also a cost to only doing greenfield development as well. So, I mean, I think we're all trying to find the right balance here, right? And so I think the piece that we're trying to emphasize, and I was just wanting to respond to Eliza's comment, because I was also wondering, since there are some items within the recommendations where we say, there was interest in the group in exploring this topic, but that was sort of, it was determined that the appropriate sort of venue for, thinking that through was the DG stakeholder group or something like that. If maybe that is a place where we could say there was interest in figuring out, how to make development on the built environment or degraded lands more economically feasible for developers, but that was determined, to be within the purview of the DG stakeholder group, or that was the appropriate place, or what have you, just, something to indicate that might be considered in the future.
Sounds like that would address, Jeremy, your concern about being completely clear about the additional costs associated with that type of development. We can wordsmith it down, when we move on to the second half of this agenda, but Selena, you go ahead.
The one additional piece, in addition to what Jeremy said, was that we would have trouble meeting all of our energy needs only from rooftops or smaller brownfield sites. And so it needs to be a combination. And so making sure that the language does not say it's either or in terms of development.
Sure. Okay, anything else on that particular point before we move on? All right. The third one was that 6 of the 20 commenters focused generally on dual use and solar grazing. Within those comments, it included expanding the definition of dual use to include grazing. And I just pointed out that the revised draft addressed that specific point and altered the definition. Any additional thinking around this, Emily? Go ahead.
I think this is another place where nuance is difficult to put in a concise, contained draft. And I think in the definition where AFT is coming from, in our distinction, is not necessarily about what sort of agricultural activity it's happening. It's about the array. How was the array developed with the purpose of protecting production on site for the long term and allowing flexibility. And you can have a standard array that does not do that, but you can have co-location of sheep and grazing, which is just an incredible use of that site. And so there may be nuance in the definitions that is lost that could be clarified. And it's really more about, true dual use can do lots of things for a long time. And there's co-location that can be integrated into standard arrays. That doesn't mean that's not agricultural activity, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is dual land use on that site. So I think some clarity around that. I have some suggestions when we get to that part.
Okay. Other comments on this particular area of focus of the report? Just so we kind of generally get a sense. All right. It seemed like a bunch of what the commenters commented on had been addressed in this new draft, but I just wanted to make sure. The fourth point was several commenters wanting to encourage improved municipal planning capacity to analyze solar proposals. And one of the recommendations, I believe, speaks to that. Did that sort of raise additional issues for any of you? One commenter opposed any restrictions on the ability of farmers to site solar on their land. Any perspectives on that before we move on to some highly specific ones from three entities? Okay. The final three, one is sort of substantial, quite substantial. Maine Natural Areas Program and Inland Fisheries and Wildlife offered detailed recommendations in support of protecting rare and endangered plants, animals, and high-value habitats in the solar siting process. You'll recall they offered some, specific language to potentially be added into a number of areas of the report. We can address that as we move on to the report itself and see to what extent you think those comments are logical to include, but just wanted to get your general sense about that feedback. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Would need to be convinced that there's something that exists within the existing regulatory process that is insufficient in protecting those Do we have a deficiency in our existing standards that DEP, LUPC, or anybody else is enforcing that does not allow for that to be considered? I don't know how those types of things would be able to be ignored through a permitting process currently.
Got it. Other perspectives on that body of comments? Eliza, go ahead.
I think Jeremy's point is a good one, though I think that what is, to me, how I read the comments from MNAP and IFNW is that as we consider future policy options, that we need to incorporate natural area considerations in those. And it's no secret that I'm also, feel like we missed an opportunity to incorporate natural area considerations in this group, though I understand why we made that choice. And I think that that's an important distinction, is that, there are policy mechanisms in place right now, and there likely will be some in the future that that support solar. And as we think about those, let's think about how we can incorporate both agricultural siting considerations in those, but also natural area siting considerations in those as well. There is significant data out there suggesting that there are many of these projects are landing in areas where there are really significant natural resource values. And I think that it's a responsibility on the part of the state to think about as we're thinking about how we can support solar. We can support solar in ways that encourages avoidance of those areas.
Okay. Any other general comments about this before we sort of dig into the weeds? Obviously, I think what I'm kind of gleaning here is I do think it's been important to touch on all of these, but I think it's also hard to know what we're talking about until we get into the document and have specific suggestions on any particular changes. But I think just getting a general sense of where you're at as a group with these comments is helpful background. So I'm happy to move on unless you want to talk any more about this point now, because it sounds like
Judy, it looks like. Do you see my hand? This is Nancy. Can you hear me?
Nancy, go ahead.
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm having some connectivity issues, so please let me know if you can't hear me. Okay, but I did appreciate that MNAP did so clearly speak to an existing dichotomy in our report at present, where we're all familiar with the fact that we made the decision not to really focus on the forestry aspect of solar, and we state as much early in the report. And yet later in the matrix, there is language encouraging development or co-location of solar projects within woodlands. And that is a cross purpose, quite literally within the report, in my opinion. So I do think it is something that the group today should consider, whether or not we are okay with living at that, with leaving that in, despite that dichotomy, or potentially removing it from the matrix.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, we'll definitely circle back to that. The final two comments, sort of themes that we pulled out of the comments, were that the Land Use Planning Commission offered its permitting data for any future database or clearinghouse that's associated with recommendation 1. And Senator Brenner suggested prioritizing PFAS sites for solar. You've spoken about that issue sort of generally already, but any high-level comments about either of those themes before we move over to the report itself? And were there other themes that any of you picked up that you feel were not represented in this summary that we prepared that you want to flag for the rest of the group?
Hey, Jody, this is Matt. I'm driving. Apologies
Sure.
for not raising my hand or being on camera. I just wanted to mention that what I don't see is kind of a reflection of where we are in terms of, so did go through this kind of flash of community solar projects and net energy billing projects. They tended to be smaller projects sprinkled around the state. We're kind of driving in the rearview mirror a little bit on that, because I think that's not happening going forward in a near as much volume. You know, at least that's not the signal that I get from a policy perspective. It's going to be more driven toward utility scale solar projects or larger scale that by definition will go through a much more rigorous permitting process than these 20-acre solar projects. So I think I just wanted to raise, I don't quite see it in here that, you know, we've got a phenomena that happened recently, and with a bunch of projects kind of maybe not going through that full permitting process, and it's raised some issues, you know, not the least of which might be the MNAP and IFNW stuff. I'm not sure, but the utility scale projects, anything greater than 20 acres is going to go full, you know, full siting review, site location of development, NRPA, potentially Army Corps of Engineers, you know, lots and lots of scrutiny. And I would just say, just in terms of meeting energy goals, we're going to need projects like that to be successful, and adding additional barriers to those. It takes 4 years to get through the interconnection process. It takes, you know, 200+ days now to get through DEP. There's lots of risk, lots of obstacles. And if we really are going to go big on clean energy, I think we want to be careful about, you know, just adding a ton of new restrictions that might be helpful if you were anticipating another wave of small projects that were less regulated. But we're in fact anticipating a wave of projects that is more regulated already by their very nature. So just wanted to throw out that perspective. And I agree with the previous comments about balance as the goal of the report. And so just wanted to emphasize that before we go into the weeds.
Got it. Okay. And you did cut out right at the very beginning. I just want to check with the rest of the group to make sure that you understood the essence of Matt's comments, even without that, the beginning there. Just maybe a nod of heads or something that you got it, you understood. Okay. All right. So I think I'm seeing Nick and then Ellen and then Nancy, perhaps in that order. Nick and then Nancy and then Ellen.
Thank you. Jody, before just, you know, taking a deeper dive, I think one thing I appreciate, you know, taking all the comments and looking at majority voices and percentages as a way to perhaps try to sum them up. Nothing wrong with that. There are also some very strong individual voices that might not represent majorities or, you know, high percentages in the comments, but there's some very strong comments there that, you know, are also advocating for the need to meet our energy needs for the future, and a number of tensions that they bring up. You know, Stacy Brenner's comments are a great example of that. She's just one voice in those comments, yet the PFAS issue is, holy cow, is that moving rapidly, and what we don't know is remarkable. And, you know, what we're just starting to learn is remarkable. So I think that deserves some pretty significant consideration here in the greater Maine community, particularly on the intersection with farmland. The only other thing I'd say is that, you know, 1,000 feet up still here. I think there are more than a few tensions and dichotomies presented by this report. One of them is that, you know, we as discussed briefly in the last meeting, you know, this is a very cautious report. There's all kinds of things that, I mean, the executive summary could be 30 pages long to sort of give a moment in time that and the things we were trying to take into consideration in making recommendations to others, decision makers here in the state. Part of LD 820 did say develop plans and considerations to discourage solar siting on high value land, but it also said including any suggested legislation. Now, we haven't gone there. We backed right off. We punted on things like that. That's okay. I mean, I haven't been putting up my hands all along saying, where's the legislation? But I'm saying what I am suggesting is that part of the task could have been to add a little bit more bite to some of this report. And while we're not, I think it does underscore the importance of making sure that those comments are represented and that we do give a good explanation, not apologies, but a good explanation for how we approach this and what we considered. Some of that I think is included in the current report. But I am sensing still a great deal of delicacy and explanation as we put this out further.
Got it. Thank you. Nancy and then Ellen.
Sure. In response to Senator Brenner's comments and also what Eliza mentioned in the chat, I do think to the extent that we add language in here about the consideration by the group of the built environment and prioritizing there to the extent possible. I know we will wordsmith that, and I know we will try and balance that with the challenges. Long way of saying, I think we should specifically call out PFAS. In particular, it is a priority for the state of Maine, for the Department of Ag, for the Department of Environmental Protection. And I do think that this group's voice recognizing that is an important step. And therefore, I think we just need to name it as part of whatever wordsmithing we do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that a theme that I really heard through the public comments was really the issue of land access. And I think there are multiple elements to that as it relates to our discussion. I mean, I think, and maybe this will be reflected in the summary of the public comments, but I think there is a lot of concern amongst farmers about losing access to the land that they need to lease for their operations. But I think the flip side of that is I think we heard from some farmers that they see sort of grazing projects as a way of gaining land access for their operations. And so I think, there's sort of multiple elements involved in that topic, but I think it's a really important one to highlight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I tried to get at that in the way that I worded the first bullet, but I see what's missing there. I mentioned that many noted the need to preserve the state's ability to grow food, but I think to your point, the need to preserve farmland access and the state's ability to grow food is probably more accurate to what was actually in the comments. Selena, go ahead.
The only additional comment I have on the comments is that I think it's important to remember that there were only 20 comments, and that really doesn't reflect. I mean, those comments are helpful and important, and I think important to acknowledge in the report and to talk through. But what I'm trying to communicate is that there are other views that aren't necessarily all represented here that I think as we continue through this process, it's important to, if our goal is to see how people view this, to have more dialogue externally facing, in addition to the small group here, if that's an important component of future efforts.
Thank you. Patrick.
Before we move on from discussing the public comments, I just want to say that, first of all, thank you to everyone who submitted comments, but also I was encouraged that many of the concerns in the comments were considered by this group. They may not have all shown up in the report, but I think of one example, the difference in soils between blueberry fields and otherwise considered prime farmland, that was considered. And that's just one example to pull from the top of my head. So I do want to say I'm encouraged that this group has considered most of this material already.
Mm-hmm. Well, would it serve the group best to move to public input and and then get going on the draft report itself. I'm sensing that that might be a more, productive getting into the weeds at this point of the report. Any objections to that? Okay. All right. Let's do that then. We'll see if any attendees of the 12 public members would like to make a comment at this point. And rather than going right to break after it, we'll get going on the report and take a break partway in. And so if you want to just raise your hand if there's any member of the public wanting to comment. Okay. And if that for any reason isn't working for, I don't know if you may all be muted, but anyway, I'm not seeing any. If I'm mistaken, you might put a comment in the chat if I've missed your interest in speaking, and otherwise we'll move on to the document itself. So if you want to take the December 12th version of the report, and so hopefully you all are following the chat here of Fortunate needing to step away. Nancy's here, but off video, and Caitlin will be is here as well. So and I guess I would just simply ask both Ethan and Tom, if you have heard anything from George. I'm just, it's typically he makes me aware of him being unable to attend. So I just want to make sure he wasn't trying to get in and couldn't. Okay, with all that, why don't we move to the executive summary, which is on page 4, and then just sort of, I'll just share high level what approach we decided to take here, which was that, to I think Nick's point, this could have been a 30-page executive summary. It could have exceeded the length of the report itself. And yet, sort of on principle, we thought, don't have anything show up in the executive summary that you can't find somewhere else in the report, and have it be as concise as possible to just sort of give the general architecture of the report and the process. So it, we view, essentially the executive summary as pages 4, 5, and 6. And are there any sort of glaring errors or things that you wished had been emphasized in here that are not? Emily, go ahead, and then Ellen.
I think on page 5 in the second paragraph of the stakeholder group purpose, that starting, somewhere in the middle of that second paragraph, maybe around line 10, where we say the stakeholder group focused its research and recommendations on the intersection of agricultural lands and solar, that may be an occasion or a place to put in something along the lines of, while the group discussed and considered other, siting, including the built environment and contaminated lands, then say that ultimately it was decided that we will simply focus and we will, really dedicate our time onto this intersection piece. I think early on, if we set that piece of information out there, that we understand that there are other pieces, but this group is focused on this piece, so we haven't spent a lot of time discussing that, might help engage readers with the fact that we're not talking about how do we necessarily incentivize other types of siting, even though we know it's sort of the other side of the coin.
Sure. Any concerns about that addition before I move on to Ellen? Okay, then we'll do. Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah, well, my first thing is maybe a small point, but because I know later on in the report, we have a whole section on consensus, but I think it's important on page 4, just when we're talking about advancing recommendations, just to remind the reader that the stakeholder group reached consensus to advance 7 recommendations, for instance, on line 21, just for, I think just to make it clear that the recommendations that are being put forward are the recommendations that we were able to reach agreement on I think that's an important thing to emphasize throughout the report. And then on page 5, under Maine won't wait, when we talk about some of the different updated climate action plan recommendations that are, or strategies that are at play as part of our discussion, I also think it would be important to include the strategy to increase by 2030 the total acreage of conserved lands in the state to 30%, which includes farmland, just because I think that's another recommendation that is at play in this discussion as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm looking mystified because I think that was our intent to include that, and then somehow we didn't do that. Go ahead, Julianne.
I'd like to follow up on Ellen's comment about consensus, because I'm not sure that we did actually achieve consensus. I think there was a majority that agreed to most of the recommendations, but I don't see it as a unified, everyone agreed to it. So I think that, there should be some clarification around that, there isn't really a 100% consensus around all of the everything that's all of the recommendations that are being put forward.
Is that other people's perspective as well? It was not mine, so I think this is. Was it anybody else's perspective that was the case?
Yeah, I mean, I'll weigh in here. I mean, a lot of this gets very complicated because, as everybody again has heard me say 300 times, is it depends what this report is used for and where it goes from here. So my willingness to embrace and endorse these recommendations is predicated upon what happens next. So I realize none of us can predict the future, and legislators and advocates can seek policy changes anytime they want, but I have some reticence to say we warmly embrace all 7 of these recommendations in whole cloth.
So just words matter here. So nowhere in the report does it say we all warmly embrace. So in fact,
right, but the implication here, when you list all of the organizations and then say we all agreed, okay, remove the editorial comment of warmly embrace, accept and endorse. However we want to wordsmith it, the implication is that everybody has signed on to this. And
so
that's what I'm suggesting.
Yeah. So why don't we take a look at lines 20 and 21 together as a group on page 4?
And Nancy's hand, sorry to interrupt you, has been up for a while too. I don't know if you're missing that one.
So sorry, I'm not seeing that. Sorry. Nancy, you go ahead while we then turn to lines 20 and 21.
Why don't we do that first? I think that's more relevant. I don't want to lose the momentum there, and you can come back.
Okay, sorry about that, Nancy. The stakeholder group advances 7 recommendations. That is what it says. And my understanding, just to be clear, is that what that doesn't mean is that everyone on the stakeholder group is as wildly enthusiastic about each recommendation as everyone else, that there are likely recommendations that some people feel more excited about than others, and that listing of prioritization or love for recommendations will differ by each of you, but that each of you is okay about advancing these recommendations. And what I'm concerned about is at the last meeting, losing ground over areas where I believe we hashed these out pretty extensively. So I just want to get comments on lines 20, basically 21 and 22, because I think we parsed that very carefully.
I can start just by saying that I support the language as it is in line 20 and 21, and maybe to add some color to that, and to be transparent, there are many things that I would have really liked to have seen in this report and that aren't here. However, because I felt very committed to getting to consensus, within these, I did not push those because I know that they were not a place where we could get together as a broader stakeholder group. However, the ones that are here are ones that I feel like I can get behind, even though they aren't as complete as I personally would have liked them to have been.
Ellen, and then I'm going to make a suggestion. Oh, sorry. No, sorry. Are we, I'm assuming you're still on this point. I don't want to lose you, Nancy. Are you still okay with us sticking with this, assuming that?
Absolutely. Yeah, no worries.
Okay. Ellen, this is on the same topic?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with Eliza's comment. And I think when I was saying the stakeholder group reached consensus to advance, it means like we just to emphasize sort of Eliza's points that this isn't sort of all of our top 7 recommendations that we would like to see necessarily on this topic, but that, we were all committed to this process and we were able to reach consensus to advance these 7 recommendations in the report.
Thank you. Patrick, I'm going to take you and then Julianne.
Yeah, so when I look at our ground rules and our decision-making process, I don't think we ever fell back to the method of taking votes and creating essentially a minority opinion to include in the report. So I feel like this is done by consensus. I agree, we're not all thrilled with every aspect of it, but I do think we're advancing these recommendations by consensus. And if that makes it a stronger document leading into legislation, then I'm good with including the term consensus in those lines.
Thank you. Julianne, go ahead.
I think actually, I mean, I guess I still just take umbrage with the word consensus because we're not in support of all of these recommendations. And there wasn't really an opportunity for that minority report as Patrick identified. And so I think, as Jeremy suggested in the language he just put in the chat, there needs to be some identification of not everybody, there isn't consensus. There is a majority support for these ideas. There is not 100% support across the board from every organization sitting on this group.
Let me switch to this chat language that Jeremy put in there for, I'm assuming, the group's consideration. And I would imagine that on, you mean of. Thoughts on that language? Are you seeing advances 7 recommendations with varying degrees of stakeholder enthusiasm, of stakeholder group member enthusiasm? And I think that, there are other ways to say this, to acknowledge that, oh, sorry, posting this in the open chat. Yeah, we'll do that in just a moment, Lisa. I guess rather than wordsmithing, does this group think that it would be best to include the general sentiment that, the essence of the sentiment that Jeremy posted, which is to essentially add language like the group advances 7 recommendations with varying degrees of stakeholder enthusiasm? Emily, go ahead.
I think it a little bit depends. If there are folks on the stakeholder group that think that some of these recommendations should not be there, that's different than everyone at least being in agreement that these 7 can be moved forward. If there's agreement that these 7 can be moved forward regardless of our opinion, that's consensus that these 7 can move forward, not that's consensus that we all think these 7 are the way to go. If there's some of these 7 that folks think should not be moved forward or have very strong feelings about it, then I think that we may need to wordsmith language here. That's not the case for me, so I can't, as with Ellen and Eliza, these 7 are, I agree that these 7 should move forward. There are others that I wish were here that are not. So I'm not in the situation where I think some of these should not be moved forward. But
so because this is the first that I understood, Julianne, that you did not support some of these 7, could you just clarify which ones you don't?
I mean, I'm happy to add in a full statement from Maine Farm Bureau at the end to say which we support and which we don't, rather than spending a significant amount of time on this. But I do want it clarified right at the beginning that, you know, there were not votes taken. This was not this was most people agreed with, we should push this forward. And that's what happened. So I feel like there needs to be clarification about the process of how consensus was achieved. It was not a voting. There was not, it was most people agreed with this. Okay, so we're going to move forward. And I think that needs to be clear in the report for anyone who's reading it and is not going to go back and watch the numerous hours of debate that we had.
Happy to weigh in, but I want to get the co-chair's perspective on this before I comment further. Any perspectives that either of you have on this point?
I think that by my view of the way that this report is written is we have taken a lot of steps to try and explain that this was a stakeholder process over 8 months of meetings where we reviewed a lot of information, some of which we then prioritized in terms of making very broad recommendations on. And to someone's point earlier, there's no legislative request coming out of this per se. There's a lot more activity and action that needs to happen for further development and refinement. And I believe, from my perspective, that type of process over 8 months through facilitation is a consensus activity. It's a general agreement on a body of work. It is not, and if we want to be more definitive that there were not votes taken, but it was more of just a natural progression of stakeholder input that refined down to these 7, perhaps there's a way to do that. I am loath at this last hour to start retreating into certain areas where we want to stake claim, and I would really ask that we can find a way to nuance this.
Thank you. Selena?
I agree with Nancy's comments generally, but I think the way I look at it differently is that I like some language similar to something that gets at Jeremy's point, so that should there be a legislative package 3 years down the road, all of our names are not necessarily endorsing that package if it's the same recommendation. That gives us people space to have different views of how these get implemented and what they look like. But acknowledging, I think to Nancy's point, that we've tried, these are not everyone's favorite recommendations written as they individually would if it was their opportunity to do it. I think it's the benefit of all of us working together, and some people have varying feelings about different recommendations. And so I'm comfortable with some acknowledgement of that. But I do agree that we've gotten to a point where hopefully we can at least move it forward, advance it together would be my goal.
Julianne, do you have any other remarks, having heard those comments? Okay. All right, then I think we'll move on from that point. Are there other, so I'm nervous about this hand raised that I'm not seeing.
Mine's been up for a while.
Nancy, come back, we'll go to you. Go.
What's going on with my hand today, guys?
Go ahead. No, I got stuck on attendees panel.
It's okay, no big deal. And in fact, I have a little bit of an editorial suggestion that where am I? On page, I think it's page 5, lines 12 through 14. We were very deliberate as a group here to talk about what the stakeholder group did not focus on, and in particular, it's working forests. It struck me upon review and thinking that maybe we could also state that we didn't also consider to any great degree installation, design, and decommissioning considerations. Just at the top, the point of my speaking to that is just so that readers right off the bat understand that that's maybe a reason why they wouldn't see it further in the report. So it's not a substantive addition, it's just another declaration of what we didn't dig into.
Any questions or concerns about that? Go ahead,
I think if we're
Jeremy.
going to reference decommissioning, we should talk about the fact that DEP requires it, in addition to the fact that just about every host community is requiring it. So I don't want to make a reference to decommissioning and say this group didn't examine it, if we're not going to then make a reference to the DEP standard that exists currently.
Thoughts on that, Nancy?
I think that's a great point. Yeah, no problem with that.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts on that point before we move on to Nick? Okay, go ahead, Nick.
I just want to be sure we're giving some attention to some of the points that are coming up in the chat. There's some excellent points being made in the chat. Patrick directing us to page 8 to think about perhaps an opportunity where we can maybe it's wordsmithing, identify what our process was, that there is language there that talks about the process, and a little bit deeper on how we were defining consensus, and the word agreement is used there. I also want to be sure it doesn't have to be this moment that we touch on what Andy has offered in the chat, which I think is an excellent point. And yeah, I'll stop. Thanks.
Got it. Yep. I think we've covered that. I think, Andy, we've covered that. You can let me know if I'm mistaken. And duly noted about page 8. Okay. Let's stick with the executive summary, pages 4, 5, 6 for a moment longer. Is there anything else in that section that any of you would like to see altered, either because of your own observations or things that you want to pull over from sentiments from public comments? Okay. All right. I'm assuming that 7 is good. Page 7 is good. And that we could move then on to page 8 on the stakeholder group process. Any additional guidance that you want to give relative to this decisions by consensus? I think we have a lot to work with the tape and the conversation. So, Ethan, if I'm mistaken and you want more clarification or more specific wording, please speak up. But have we addressed that sufficiently with comments that have already been made as far as group members are concerned? Okay. Anything else on this page as far as process goes? All right, I'm inclined to keep going. It's 10:15 and maybe we take a break at around 10:30-ish. If you're all comfortable continuing on in the background for the solar energy policy and industry landscape section, which goes from pages 9 through 12. Any changes or additions to that section that you'd like to see? Okay. And then how about the next section on the background for the agriculture and solar development potential? That's pages 13 through 15. Okay.
Sorry, Jody. I had one question, if I could get clarification from the authors. For lines 5 and 6, the small diversified farms across Maine supply niche markets with organic produce and meat value added products as well as fiber products. I just was a little bit confused by the use of the term organic, because that can mean different things to different readers. And there's an organic produce market, but there's also a conventional produce market that is a niche market. So I'm just confused about how those niche market and how organic is being used in this context.
Tom, do you want to weigh in, or we could take it as a good point made? Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I think that was actually Nancy's wording, but yeah, I can see Julianne's point that it's not only organic produce, conventional ag is a part of that as well. So we can work on that.
Yeah, and certainly no, great point, Julianne. And we're happy to make the changes that you're requesting there to tease that out further, and certainly avoid any type of, just make it a broader statement.
Great. Okay. And I'm also seeing Andy's comment. This is minor, but I feel like the pictures included in the beginning of the report don't really accurately reflect the scale of the projects that we've been discussing. So duly noted, and we can work on that. Folks, if anybody disagrees with that, just please speak up. And go ahead, Ellen.
This is also just a minor point, but just again, what I mentioned earlier on page 15, lines 16 through 21, just when we're talking about the different sort of Maine won't wait strategies, we just also would want to include the land conservation strategy, strategy as well.
Okay, it's in there about food consumption, local food consumption, but not land conservation. Okay, got it. Julianne, go ahead.
One other just general question about this section where PFAS testing is ongoing. Should there be a statement within there somewhere that says, X number of acres has been identified as PFAS contaminated, that was previously identified as prime farmland? Should there be any identification of that, especially where it is such a critical emphasis currently?
I can speak to that. I don't think we're at a point right now to be able to necessarily quantify solidly. There will be more time for that, unfortunately. So while I think it's important for the two departments, DEP and DACF, to be able to answer that question sooner rather than later, I don't think we can right
now. Julianne, was there, just remind me, on pages 13 through 15, was there a general reference to PFAS, but you were hoping for it to be more specific, or there isn't any reference to it at all yet?
No, I don't believe there's any reference to it. I didn't know if we, and Nancy, to your point, I know we don't have any data. I know that's ongoing, but I didn't know if we needed to add in a general recognition of, the 2021 map of prime land farm, or may not be the same as 2022 or 2025. Given the PFAS contamination.
Oh, I got it. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm fine with leaving that out. I just wanted to take a minute to consider that, because it will make a difference later on, but I also recognize that we don't have that data yet.
So are Nancy, you comfortable with the concept being added that, what could be accurately defined as prime farmland is, in essence, in flux as a result of the PFAS issue?
I don't think it would be a benefit to add that in here. I feel it would be somewhat out of place with just the flow and the overview as presented here. I don't disagree that with all the field work that is undergoing with DEP now and in the coming years, that we likely will have a data set that will allow for that information in the future, but not right now. So I just don't think it's necessary to include that there, but I appreciate Julianne's point.
Got it. Okay. Then anything else in this section describing the state of agriculture relative to solar? All right, then the primary areas of stakeholder group research is, a significant section. It runs from page 16 through 22. I'm happy to have us start on that, see the degree to which there are changes to recommend, and see how far we get through that and whether we can finish that before we go on break for a moment. Want to get going and maybe take a couple sections at a time: Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Vermont, which are on the first 2.5 pages. Any changes, comments to those sections? 16, 17, and part of 18 pages.
I had a quick observation and suggestion, and it's in line with what I had voiced maybe during our prior meeting, where I thought there could be additional summary statements here and there to just help orient a reader coming to this conversation for the first time. So for instance, Emily and I worked together, mostly Emily, to imbue a little bit more context around Massachusetts SMART program, and that language is now in there. And I realized in looking at Vermont, there's a statement on page 18, line at the very top, 1, 2, 3. The final sentence says, changes in the policy were a result of a variety of factors, including the cost and pace of solar development. And I was just wondering if people would say, what do they mean by pace? Is there some sort of statistic or summary point that could be made about Vermont's situation? I don't think we necessarily need to go into that right now. Perhaps we could, Emily and I could wordsmith that again, but clearly that would be if the group sees the broader value of that. My point again is just to provide additional context to someone who's picking up this for the first time and sees that statement.
Do the rest of you understand that suggestion? And if so, would you support it?
Sorry, could you just rephrase it briefly?
Sorry, I'm imagining you're asking Nancy.
Yeah. So in the final, second to last paragraph, page 18, line 2, changes in the policy were a result of a variety of factors, including the cost and pace of solar development, period. I just find that to be an interesting statement without a lot of context. And I wondered if it would be possible to add some sort of illustrative statement, just describing that, teasing that out a tad bit more. That's all.
Are folks comfortable with that idea? Do we have any of that knowledge in the room right now as to what those issues were? I know, Genevieve could answer that, Byrne could answer that, but do we have that knowledge here?
I think she discussed some of it. We're just watching the video could probably pull a little bit of that back out. But if not, I'm also happy to reach out to Genevieve to see if she could provide a sentence or two to help provide context.
Okay, all right, we'll go that route one way or the other. Were there other areas, Nancy, that to your general point about adding a little bit more clarification in areas?
I think that covered it, but I'll I'll pipe up if something else strikes me.
And so why don't we move on to pages 18, which covers the Maine Audubon, Maine Municipal Association, Blue Wave, and Clemeto. Go ahead, Julianne, and then Patrick.
I had one comment from some of my farmers that on under the Maine solar programs and results, in the paragraph starting with line 14, the use of the word intersect they found confusing. So would it be possible to just, this is on page 18. So if we could just have a little bit of clarification of how that term is being used in this context, or
Eliza, any perspective on that before I go to you, Patrick? This is page 18, lines 17 and 18.
yes.
Sorry, I'm toggling. I'm just making sure I'm getting to the right place. So just the intention there is to say that where some of these soils of importance are located is also where high value plant animal habitat is located, et cetera. I don't have an immediate recommendation on a word that might be more clear than intersect.
We'll work on that. Okay, thank you. Patrick.
As far as the Maine municipal section goes, it's the only one of these research blocks where recommendations are laid forth. None of the other groups had that, and I think one is a little bit confusing as a reader because there are recommendations being listed before reaching the stakeholder group's recommendation. And I also noticed that the bullet point starting on line 10 is really contrary to one of the points that we're trying to advance. So I would prefer to see the MMA section really just describe the background of the issues that they consider rather than getting into their specific recommendations.
What do folks think about that? It sounds like you're sort of suggesting eliminating on page 19, lines 1 through 15.
Yes, and some of that might be able to be included or just explained as issues that MMA considers, or there might be another way to explain their work without listing them as recommendations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with Patrick. I hadn't really read it in that way. It sort of picked up on the fact that we're seeing their recommendations before the groups, but that's a very good point. I totally.
This is Nancy. I appreciate Patrick bringing that up because there is a stark contrast between what MMA recommended and then what this group recommends. And perhaps there could just be a declarative statement at the end summarizing that the stakeholder group appreciated MMA's review and suggestions. However, just basically laying the path that our recommendation is going to be the opposite to that. That's one suggestion of trying to resolve that.
I think, yeah,
difference.
So there's been two suggestions on, there's sort of, I think, two suggestions on the table. One is to eliminate or replace the list of recommendations with, sort of a paraphrasing of some of the points that MMA made. A second is to, I'm not sure if I'm characterizing your point correctly, Nancy, to retain the list of recommendations, but point out that the stakeholder group reached a different conclusion with respect.
Or we could do both, Jody. I'm happy to do both. I think it would be necessary to still tease out here that MMA presented its case, and the stakeholder group came to different conclusions as discussed further in this report.
Mhm. Are folks comfortable with that set of recommendations, sort of a two-point approach? Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I feel, if I'm understanding Nancy correctly, I think I feel a little bit more comfortable with that. I wouldn't just want to remove the recommendations. That's not to say I agree with all of them, but I wouldn't want MMA to feel like we were sort of censoring the information that is made available as to what they presented. But if formatting changes or putting in the disclaimer, that Nancy suggested, I think could make sense. I'm happy, I would support sort of, if it felt strange to have the bullet list to restructure it in some way, but I do think it, it is what was presented to us. So I wouldn't want to just kind of eliminate that part of their presentation.
And just to clarify what I was hearing from Patrick, but please let me leave that to you, Patrick, to see if I'm understanding correctly, that you weren't recommending eliminating the essence of it, but rather to summarize it in a manner that was more narrative, more streamlined, so that we accurately capture the general perspective of MMA, but not in recommendation form and not necessarily with this level of detail. Is that accurate, Patrick?
Yes, I think that's I think that's fair to say.
Okay. Julianne.
I guess I echo what Ellen was saying, and I would be concerned about putting any sort of commentary on MMA's remarks if we're not going to do that for every other group that we're also presenting information to. If we're presenting every other group neutrally, and then we are only commenting on MMA, that can, I think, raise some eyebrows.
This is Nancy. I can appreciate that. That's not my intention. I just think, again, there were some places in the report where we were looking at things such as Massachusetts SMART, and I think we have a statement in there basically saying the group saw attributes of the program that were attractive and yet others that weren't. So there was a little bit of commentary there, and so I was just from a perspective of allowing that to reoccur where appropriate. That's where I was coming from with that suggestion for some sort of explanation. But if that doesn't sit well, I can totally respect that too.
An alternative, and then I'll take you, Jeremy, an alternative would be to acknowledge it in the recommendation itself, that there is an explicit recommendation at the end of the report that speaks to current use, and there could be an acknowledgement there that says that notwithstanding the perspective of MMA, blah blah blah. So you could consider that. Jeremy, go ahead.
One other idea could be to basically just take everything that they've got from on page 19, lines 1 through 15, and essentially just create a header that says MMA also provided specific recommendations which can be found in Appendix B, and just put it at the end of the report.
So we've got a number of different approaches, I think all trying to get at the same thing, which is to sort of not de-emphasize, but certainly not have MMA ideas preempt the recommendations of the group as a whole. So I think I'm understanding that to be the general sentiment. How we go about that, if folks have really strong opinions as to which tack is taken, all of them sort of, to the extent that it matters, all of them to me seem like they could solve the problem. So I think just kind of getting a sense of how strongly you feel about selecting which approach is taken would be helpful, as opposed to sort of giving the authors, the staff, the license to sort of figure out what they think would be the clearest approach to take. Do you feel strongly that we take one approach versus another based on the ideas offered? Jeremy, do you still have your hand up and have another thought? No, okay. Would you like me to paraphrase the ideas so you can vote? You've got, all right, I'm going to do that. You've got the, turn this list, take this list out of bullet form, summarize the essence of it so that the points are not lost. And at the end of that, make a note similar to what was done in the Massachusetts SMART section that the group considered it, but moved in a different direction in one way or another. Alternatively, you take the whole thing out and you make an appendix out of it. The third option is to, well, I see those as the major two. Ellen, go ahead. No, Emily, sorry.
I think we want to try to fix it in text. If we make an appendix, I think then it could lead to pulling out the recommendations from all of the other presentations and perhaps taking away the focus of the recommendations that this stakeholder group is making. So if we could find a way to summarize without taking away any of the actual content and shifting any of the opinion, and just making the disclaimer that this is what was presented, but not the stakeholder recommendations, that would be my preferred route.
Are folks okay with that approach? Okay, yeah, that's great. I'm glad because
I would actually really prefer that Jeremy's suggestion that it be put in an appendix. I feel like if we're going to, I just have concerns with, at this point, we're not going to see the summary that's done. And one person's summary may not be the same way someone else would summarize it. So I think they took the time to identify those concerns. I'm happy to put them in an appendix, but I think they should be identified in the way the MMA has presented them.
Emily, is your hand still up for a new idea? No. Other perspectives on, so I think I'm hearing that, well, Jeremy, where are you at with the options at this point? I know it was your idea to possibly do that, but I don't know if you felt that that was strongly a better idea or if you're comfortable with the approach that Emily has suggested.
I don't have a real firm opinion of this. I just would love for us to figure it out and move on.
Julian, I guess I would ask whether you would, I think that my sense is that the way this would be summarized is to essentially take it out of bullet form. So it looks less like a list, and that a list of recommendations, and more like here's a narrative that describes what are in these bullets. So I don't believe, I think I can commit to that the points not being lost, that it would not be a misinterpretation or a different, I don't think you'd look at a narrative and feel like something else was conveyed than what these points convey, but it would enable the point to be made at the end of the paragraph that says, the group really did arrive at a different conclusion relative to one of the points anyway, because that's the one it discussed in detail, and that was the current use program. So I guess I'm wondering if you could be comfortable with that, given the comfort that the rest of the group has.
I guess, is there going to be an opportunity for us to review that?
No.
Then I will reiterate my discomfort.
Thoughts, Selena and Nancy, on how you'd like to handle that?
I completely agree that essentially we're just going to package this differently without bullets, but the text is going to remain essentially the same.
Yeah, I feel like if we just put commas between them or semicolons, and we can preserve them in their original form, even, I mean, I'd be something like that, and I would feel comfortable with moving forward with that.
That to me is different than summarizing it. So yeah, if we're leaving it, the language the same, and we're just putting in semicolons, that's great.
Okay, great, thank you. All right. We're at 10:37, but I'm going to ask whether we could push through to, well, maybe not. Would you like to take a break right now and then pick back up in the middle of page 19? Or would you like to finish this section? What's your preference? Take a break? I'm seeing some head nodding. All right, let's do that and we'll come back at 10:45. All right, thanks. Hi. Hey, Caitlin. First one back. Nick. I want Andy to come back so he can see my water glass today. My Milk House yogurt water glass. Let's see, we've got Ellen. I'm going to assume that folks are not back if I'm not physically seeing them. So if you're here, if you could turn on your video just so I know. Patrick, thank you. Eliza, thanks. So I'm thinking we don't yet have, oh, and do we have you back, Nancy? I know you're needing to keep your video off. Thanks, Andy. So I'm looking for, oh, right. Sorry, Andy, I remember that now. Julianne, fortunate we won't have. Matt, do we have you still driving?
We don't see him on the list anymore.
Okay. So do we have Nancy, Jeremy, and Julianne? Any of those three? Okay, great. Thank you, Julianne. Nancy and Jeremy. Okay. Well, we'll hope for them. And why don't we keep going on page 19, perspective from Next AMP. Why don't we cover Next AMP, Blue Wave, and Clemedo? Any changes or additions to those sections? A very minor. Reference to New Jersey recommend. Okay, can you bring that up again, Caitlin, when we get to recommendations, just so that I don't lose that?
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. And okay, sorry, I was at the bottom. All right, I'm not hearing any additions to those three sections, so we're back onto page 21, other topics, DEP land use regulations, Maine Revenue Service, which I think we talked about in a fair amount of detail. Pollinator scorecard and in lieu fee. Anything on those four? Go ahead, Eliza.
Thanks. I'm just going back to the public comments. We received a very specific comment from MNAP and IFNW about this topic or this section, and they suggested adding a section under other topics related to natural resource concerns. And that was on page 11 of the public comments. I like the addition that they suggested, and I'm curious if others are as well. However, I'd offer one or a couple recommendations. Some of what they have offered as a specific addition could be read as recommendations. Instead, I think it would be useful to change the language somewhat to say this is information that has been provided to the group related to natural resource considerations, as opposed to what could be read as recommendations, consistent with previous conversations we've had today.
So just to make sure that we're all looking at the same thing, if you go to page 11 of the public comments document, I think what you're referring to, Eliza, is halfway down the page under a section that is structured as recommendations, but no,
but close. The top of that page, the top of page 11. So it says for inclusion under other topics, page 17. And I think they're suggesting a new header that says natural resource concerns.
So why don't I give you all a moment to review that again? And are you suggesting that, are you recommending that that full first big paragraph be added in, Eliza?
Yes, with some changes, for instance, to make it clear that these are not the recommendations of the stakeholder group, but more information that the stakeholder group has taken in. An example of that meaning being, where'd it go? It says the presence of and means to avoid and minimize impacts to, et cetera, et cetera. It says should also be considered. I would recommend changing that to something like we have heard perspectives about avoiding those natural resources, something like that. So it cannot be confused that these are not recommendations from this group.
Okay, notwithstanding the wording that makes it sound like a recommendation, if all of you could just take a moment to read that big fat paragraph at the top of the page and see if you have any concerns about that being added as another section of the other topics portion of the final report. Does that give you enough time to have read it again? Again, rephrased so that it would not be, the suggestion that Eliza is making is that it be rephrased in certain ways so that it not be directive as a recommendation. But in terms of the content of it, what are your opinions about that?
Julie has her hand up.
Thank you. Julianne, go ahead.
Thanks. I guess my concern is that when a piece of property, a piece of land is in agricultural production, there are different considerations and expectations of those natural resources and how they're viewed. So I think we're crossing into dangerous territory. Are we looking at solar on farmland, which has a different consideration than solar on any land? So I think we need to be very careful about putting this into the report. You know, again, I think it's important to keep it in the public comment, but I'm not sure exactly how that fits into our report.
Yeah, thank you. Selena, go ahead.
I have similar thoughts in that I appreciate the comments and think that they're, you know, it's helpful to have in the public comment section, but that it goes beyond the topics that we've decided to cover in this report. And so that's my only concern with this. Is the only place where we're really delving into those, and that they may not fit in with the rest of the topics that we discussed.
Do others share that general perspective? I see one head nodding, and go ahead, Nick.
I share that general perspective at this time in our process. We are at the end of our planned process. I'm I'm trying my best to, in some cases, bite my tongue, because I don't think that at the point we are in our process, we can do maybe some of the things we want to do, speaking to our constituents and our interests. And I think that's very frustrating for people. I've been toying with the word, not consensus, but indignant resignation, that we're sort of at this place like, and not every member of this stakeholder group is on this call. A lot of people that have been here for the last 7 sessions aren't able to be today or had to leave already this meeting. So it's not really a matter about, in some cases, whether I agree or not, bear with me, with adding some comments. It's, can we do that in a large scale format at this place and time when we don't have the opportunity to go back and see again how those comments are summarized, or make sure that every member has that, like Andy had brought up, and I think was attempted at the beginning here, for us all to sound off individually on those key points. It feels a little bit like we got a couple wheels on the rail here, but we're tipping. The train's tipping here. It's tough. And I mean, I absolutely have reactions to a lot of what's being said, and I don't know if how we honor that. And I don't know if it's definitely not going to be good enough speaking to it in an executive summary. Clearly, I don't know. I mean, do we invite some of the organizational or constituents that some on this panel represent to submit additional comments to say, hey, we didn't really support some of this? I don't know. But if we've got an hour and 3 minutes to hit consensus, we're in tough shape. So I appreciate what Eliza's brought up, and I appreciated those comments. I'm not sure we can put that chunk in there right now.
Thank you, Nick. Let me take Nancy and Patrick and then make a suggestion.
Thank you, and thank you, Nick. I myself support Eliza's suggestion. I don't think it's a substantial departure from issues that have been an undercurrent here throughout. I respect, however, Nick's concern, and to the extent that we want to drive this home in the next hour, I can live with its absence as well.
Thank you. Patrick, go ahead.
So I do agree. I like the term undercurrent, because this consideration has been present, and if it could be boiled down to 1 or perhaps 2 sentences to be included in the Audubon's perspective section, then I think that can make sense. Otherwise, I am a little bit fearful that it's beyond the scope, like Julianne was suggesting, of what we chose to bite off with this group. And to Nick's thought about allowing other groups to create their own addendum, I would just really hope that rather than it being presented as these other stakeholders are saying, here's what we don't agree with, it could instead be presented as here's another stakeholders area that they would like to see addressed in the future.
All right. I'm totally open if the group wants to think about wordsmithing, whether it be as a standalone section or an addition to the Maine Audubon section. But I also did hear, clear concerns from Julianne and Selena and Jeremy that they would not likely support that approach, ideally. Ellen, let me take your thought and then make a general recommendation.
Well, I was wondering if there was a way to include the guidance materials, just as as part of the appendix, because it feels like at the end of that, right, is sort of referring people to some of those guidance materials, and with the offer to contact the agencies, you know, for assistance if they're running with respect to those materials, and also just general guidance. And so I'm wondering if there's a place somewhere to refer people to those guidance documents, and then just include them in the appendix.
Mhm. Am I mistaken? I had thought that the second document, the DACF technical guidance document, is in an appendix already. I'm sorry, is in a footnote already in the document. But I don't know that the first one is. What does the group think about that approach of making reference to these resources that do exist that can be helpful in solar siting? I'm seeing some nods. Yep. Okay. All right. Why don't we go that route? And then just a general question. I realize I'm sort of jumping ahead. We'll come back. But an additional idea is to actually have an appendix that includes the full public comments. They're not exhaustive. They're 18 pages. It would allow people to read the detail to the extent they were interested, and it wouldn't be lost. It wouldn't be lost in the form of a summary. So I'd be interested in your reaction to that idea, that be the final appendix to the document.
One quick clarification. Are the public comments available like online at this point, or are we the only people who can see them right now?
Ethan, could you speak to that? I had thought fully available.
I don't think I've put them on the meeting materials website just because I've put stuff up right after, but that's more my not having done it than by design.
And I'll add that the public comments were shared to the interested parties email list.
Right.
Thank you. Selena, go ahead.
I have no issue with the public comments being shared in any, either online, whatever makes it easier to get through the report. It's already lengthy, so perhaps a link to something online might be an easy way to do it, but flexible on that. The other thing is that in addition to recognizing the public comments, I also think that all the materials that have been presented and the people that come to speak to us are also an important component of this. And so I wouldn't want to just separate the public comment in that fact too. So it's perhaps it's all the materials that have gone into this in addition to the public comment piece that could be augment the report in some way and without attaching it all.
Okay. So then I'm hearing a few things. Make sure that there is at a minimum a link to all of the meeting materials and the public comments, and then ensure that the two referenced the two resource guides, one from IF&W and one from DACF, be referenced in the document itself, in the report itself. Anything further on that point? Or any of the additional policy discussions as a whole? So pages 20, basically page 22, before we move on to the conclusions and recommendations. Okay. All right. So the conclusions section, page 23 and 24, could we take that? No, sorry. 23 through 26. Let's take comments on any of those pages. Ellen, go ahead. And then Nick.
I have some comments with respect to the matrix. And so if people have comments before then, or if Nick has comments, if his comments are before then. Okay. So my suggestion would be just, given some of the comments, just to make clear within the matrix that we're not necessarily saying that all prime soils that are actively farmed, for instance, need to have a dual use project on them. But sort of if we could put some language for that just says like, if developed, or if the location for a solar project encourage, incentivize dual use, or something like that, just to be clear that we're talking about, if development's going to happen there, just to, to consider whether a dual use project might be a possibility.
Are folks understanding the point? No.
Okay. Yeah.
Just read it again.
Yeah. So some of the comments seemed to think that when they were looking at this matrix, like we are saying on all, for instance, I'm just dealing with the first quadrant, right? So for all actively farmed prime soils, think about a dual use project, right? Encourage, incentivize a dual use project. And just to sort of make clear that we're not saying that, I'm not saying that all actively farmed prime soil should have a dual use project on it. It's just, if you're going to have solar development on that type of land, then you might want to, think about a dual use project. Is that clear? Or
yeah. Anybody have a problem with that? It's clarifying. It's not substantive. Okay.
Real quick, I agree, and maybe it's more along the lines of adding the phrasing of, if the site of interest for this project or for a potential project is on this, then consider or incentivize dual use.
I think the sentiment is understood, and Ellen, I might suggest that you provide that point of clarification where you think it would be clearest.
Sure.
Okay. Nick, and then I don't know if you had a different point, Ellen. I'm sorry, Emily. Okay, go ahead, Nick. Sorry.
Thanks. I was looking through some of the recommendations from Solar Grazing, American Solar Grazing. The one that sort of jumped out at me first was how are we confirming viability? Retain or enhance land's agricultural productivity. There's no suggested methodology for how that's done, although some do exist for sure. And frankly, Maine Ag is a leader in that space. So there are ways, but there's no language in how that's done. And I think that's a good question. How is that confirmed?
Nick, can you remind us what?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Report that references.
Page 23.
Okay.
Under definitions of dual use and co-location.
Thank you.
27. To qualify as dual use, solar installations must retain or enhance land's agricultural productivity, both short and long term, and long term be built and maintained, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a good question. How are we confirming that? Another good question I think that came from them was that if we're recommending dual use, that perhaps that be broken out a little bit further on making those dual use sites hospitable to agriculture. There may be, I think it's good to say that it's more than just intention. It also requires some more infrastructure that facilitates ag to happen in those places. And I don't really know how that's done, but I like recognizing that recommendation from them.
Can I cut in just for a second to ask you if you have any specific ideas on how to change lines 19 through 21 of page 23 to address the organization's first point?
Well, there's a soil benchmarks program that is being used to track and modify and study soil health around New England that Maine Farmland Trust, Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners, Pennsylvania Sustainable Agriculture. There are methodologies out there that look at retaining and enhancing health on a farm. So perhaps if we are building out an addendum for recommended resources, I don't know, perhaps they can go there. As listed, that first one is rather general. I mean, Andy Smith, part of this group, he's part of the soil health benchmark study, and he's part of this stakeholder group.
Could I suggest perhaps some general language like using an accepted methodology, something that points to the fact that there are systems out there that could be and should be referenced? Okay.
Sure.
Sorry, please go on. Sorry, just wanted to make sure we captured that.
Well, I can pause for a minute, and there's some other hands, so I can pause and hands that are involved with some of the things I'm talking about.
Ellen, was your hand up to speak to anything that Nick has brought up right now? Then why don't you continue, Nick, please?
Jumping between screens here. I also, let's see here, where is it? I better pause until I find it. So I don't want to take too much time, so I'll pause.
Okay, thank you. Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah, well, this is just something I'm wondering about. I'd be interested to hear what others think. But I was thinking about when I was reading the comments and feeling like we weren't sort of doing enough necessarily to support co-location. There were some comments about that. And so I was wondering, with the marginal farmland, both the actively farmed and inactive, whether instead of just encourage development, we want to say encourage co-location as we're defining co-location now, since that is sort of involving sort of conventional ground mounted solar installations, but with some of the, environmentally beneficial plantings or that sort of thing. So I just was wondering, what folks thought about that.
So could you make sure that we are looking at the right page? So it's page 25, and which column and which row?
Sure. I'm talking within the marginal farmland row, under the actively farmed column and the inactive farmland column. I'm wondering if those two, instead of just saying encourage development, should say encourage co-location, as we're now defining it with the revised definition.
Do folks understand that change, number one? And can you support that change?
I need some clarification. I'm not really following.
Sure. So the new report, or the new version of the report, includes a revised definition for co-location, which is on page 23, lines 28 through 31. And I'm wondering, given this new definition, and some of the public comments, which sort of suggested that there's not enough encouragement within the report for co-location, I'm just wondering if within the row of marginal farmland for actively farmed land and inactive farmland, whether we would want to, and just instead of just saying encourage development, we would want to say encourage co-location.
I'm seeing an agreement in the chat from Andy. Selena, you have a question about it?
Yeah, I'm not necessarily opposed. I would just be curious to hear from either from Jeremy or others to understand any implications that has. It just hasn't been something that we've talked through fully. So I'm not opposed to it, but just want to understand the implications of making that change. And so I guess at present, a little bit uncomfortable with touching the matrix without further discussion.
I realize, Emily, you and Patrick have your hand up. Is it about this topic? Okay, Emily, go ahead, and then Patrick, sorry.
Potentially to I don't know, drive this further. I actually wonder if there is any opposition to sort of co-location as something that we would encourage everywhere as a default in places where we're not necessarily encouraging dual use. So looking back at the definition, right? Hosting non-agricultural plantings with additional environmental benefits. I wonder if we couldn't say wherever we're talking about any of the farmland, so wherever it says encourage development, including other farmland and the entire row of marginal farmland, you know, I would actually support all of those saying encourage co-location, because that's just simply, well, not simply, that's encouraging the development of these traditional ground mount, but with added environmental benefits, even if that's pollinator plantings. So.
Patrick, and then Caitlin, if I have you in the right order.
Thank you. So I certainly, on a personal level, prefer co-location. I don't like this change, however, because I fear that we're losing sight of the fact that we do need large-scale solar development in order to meet just the demands of the future. And so not knowing how changing this to co-location might stagnate some of that development. I like the matrix as it is.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm also seeing that sentiment expressed by Jeremy in the chat. Caitlin, go ahead. Sorry, Ellen, you have your hand up for another reason. No, yeah, got it. Caitlin?
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the hesitancy to make any changes this late in the process, especially since we've talked a lot about the matrix thus far. I think if we were to add encourage co-location and development, not simply just replacing it, that might balance some of those concerns. But I'll just say personally, like as Blue Wave, I agree with Emily that the pollinator and potentially grazing aspect of co-location is kind of a minimum standard for development. And I don't think that is a major cost add, or, you know, you don't have to change the design of the array to do that stuff. So I think it's within this group's purview to encourage like the best development on farmland whenever we can.
That is sort of a middle ground, and I'm wondering if those who have expressed some general concern would support wherever in the matrix it currently says encourage development, that it be changed to encourage co-location and development.
I suspect that question is mostly being aimed in my direction, or maybe
No,
I'm
I've
one of
heard
the
it.
people. But okay, well, I'll weigh in since I've already started talking. I'm really concerned about making tweaks to this. I am uncomfortable giving an answer on the fly whether we're going to change the matrix. I understand what Caitlin is saying, that perhaps it's a middle ground, but as I've expressed previously, this area gives me a lot of discomfort generally. This matrix about not just what is said, but what is unsaid or untyped. So I'm just really not in a position, particularly since I think what we've heard today is we're not going to be given another chance to take a look at this report before it's finalized and delivered to the committee. I just really don't want to see the change made. I think that's where I'm at currently.
Thank you. On a separate point, but about the matrix, Nancy, did you want to speak about this woodlot issue as well or not?
I would just reiterate that the recommendation about development in woodlots is in conflict or contrast with the early statement that we did not really review in depth forestry matters, and therefore in an ideal world we would remove that column. And I will also reiterate not wanting to upset the apple cart about the matrix and the report as we head to the final stretch here. So if it stays, the department will note, in its own way. I'm just stating for the record that the department will continue to kind of have that view with respect to forestry and that concern.
Other people's perspectives on removing the woodlot on farms column as a result of what is stated on page 5. And I'll just read what you've stated on page 5, which is that while much of Maine's prime and statewide important agricultural soils are currently occupied by forests, the stakeholder group did not focus on working forests in its deliberation or in this report. Given that, do you still want to keep that column in the matrix, or does it feel like an inconsistency to you to retain it? Patrick, are you responding to that point? Yeah, go ahead.
Julianne had her hand up first if she's.
Oh, sorry, I'm not seeing you. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Julianne.
I'm not sure what I can comment on at this point. I've had my hand up for quite a while. But I'm concerned that there have been brought forward a lot of significant changes to this document, and that we're at the point of having the expectation that we're not going to have an additional review of it. Is it possible for us to set another meeting or request an extension on the deadline from the legislature? Because it seems like there are a lot of things coming up today that really deserve robust conversation, not an on-the-fly decision.
Let me take Patrick's comment first, and then go back to the discussion at the beginning of the meeting. Go ahead, Patrick.
So let me preface this by saying I recognize Nancy is in a much better position to know how things are defined in state policy, but I like leaving the woodlot on farms there. It does specifically say it's on farms, and we have discussed that quite a bit. The inclusion of recognizing that we really didn't consider forestry land earlier in the report is really, it's a different vision of those trees, more like what George would talk about earlier, where it's really, like commercial timber harvesting type land and not a woodlot that supports an agricultural business. So I think that we have considered it, and that to me, there's a clear distinction. So I would favor keeping it.
Other perspectives on the woodlot piece?
Yeah, hey, this is Matt. I had my hand up for the first time since I've been
Sorry,
on call.
you weren't with us.
No problem. No worries. No, I agree with Patrick. I think we have spent some time talking about it, and we talked about the need to that would be a place that we want to encourage. Right, it's not being used. Farmers that I've talked to certainly, there's a lot of permitting considerations, but farmers that I've talked to and worked with, if it's not like prized deer hunting areas or DWA that's protected by the state or something like that, they like to use some of that land since they haven't put a bunch of money into making it suitable for farming, and so they, often it's part of the canvas that they want to use for solar.
Thank you. I'm seeing Emily's comment in the chat. Perhaps we can make a note that we did not consider larger forested lands like commercial forest lands. We're talking about forest land that is a part of a farm operation. Would folks be comfortable with that addition? Not in the matrix itself, but yes, I'm seeing one thumbs up. I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up.
Could you please rephrase that?
So could you look in the chat at Emily's comment? Emily's comment to everyone I'm okay with keeping the woodlots column, but perhaps we can make a note that we did not consider larger forested lands. I think the bottom line, let me just step back for a second. For many of you are aware of this process, but some not, that there was a year-long process that the Department of Ag, Conservation and Forestry underwent called the Forest Carbon Task Force that was trying to identify ways that the state's forest land could actually capture more carbon in order to help achieve the state's climate goals. And so I think it looked like to some like a contradiction to, on one hand, have one stakeholder process be encouraging development on forest land, while another substantial report coming out of the department actually was trying to come up with ways that forests could capture more carbon, that trees not be removed. So it didn't want to have two contradictory reports moving ahead that the logic of which could not be explained. So that's background, but to your question, Julianne, it's that final point in the chat that we're speaking of.
Do you want me to speak to it quickly? Would that be easier, Jody?
Please.
I just think we could reference the note on page 5, that those sentences that's saying, we did not just bring it full circle, bring that back to here. Just note, these are woodlots sited on farmland. We did not focus on working forests. Sort of the bigger piece of that is not part of this.
So I think I need a sense from the group as to whether you would support a clarifying sentence on page 5 in that regard. Selena, go ahead.
Just one clarifying question. Are those defined terms that people are, that we're relying on here?
Which?
The working woodlot, working forest area, that the language that Emily's speaking to, is that a defined term?
We didn't define it here. Is there a DACF definition of working forest versus, we have the USDA woodlot definition, I believe. If not, we should.
Just again, not understanding the implications of this language change. Not anything concerned off the top of my head, but wanting to make sure that we're being consistent and understand it fully myself.
Matt, do you have your hand up for, yeah, sorry, I don't want to miss you.
No, sorry, I forgot to lower it.
Okay, so let me ask again, if the group would be comfortable with a sentence or a phrase added onto page 5, line 14, that clarifies yeah, I think it would be there, that clarifies that to the extent, something about to the extent that the matrix focuses on woodlots, it is it's focusing on wood. I'm struggling here because this is a contradiction, but if folks are wanting to retain the woodlot column, I think there's it sounds to me like folks are expressing the need to sort of better define what we mean by woodlots, and that we are not talking about commercial forest land at a large scale. I think that's what the point here is being made, that if it's going to remain in there, let's clarify what woodlots mean, what scale of woodlots we're talking about.
I think Patrick put a note in the chat. I think we can make as he says, an explanatory footnote on the matrix, because we have the definition of woodlots below. I don't know that we need to change page 5, but we can sort of bring the language and bring that note back into our explanatory footnote for the matrix.
How does that sound to everyone?
I think that, I guess, again, I'm having issues with making significant changes without time to consider them. Woodlot, to me, you could have a 10-acre woodlot on a piece of farm property, but you can also have a 10-acre woodlot on a piece of property that is not farmland. So I'm happy with a language clarification that states that this is specific to farm properties, but if it's getting mushy when you start saying, well, we didn't consider larger properties. Well, some farms have 400 acres of woodland. Some farms have 10 acres. So I'm getting concerned about, I don't feel like this should be our final meeting.
I mean, to Julianne's point, if you go to page 26, lines 21 and 22, we have a specific definition of woodlot on farms. I'm not hearing enough consensus to make any change about this topic. So my instinct is to move on, and Nancy, that there be, that tension between two reports referencing this in very different manners.
Yep.
Okay.
I understand.
Okay. All right, then shall we move on to page 27 in the recommendations themselves and see if you have any, maybe the subgroup, could the subgroup identify itself, though there were many of you who worked on sort of the additional clarifying language. So it was Selena and Nancy, Eliza, Caitlin, and Ellen. Anyone else who's not on the call today? And can you reiterate what your charge was from the last meeting, just so the group's reminded? Any one of you? I'm happy to paraphrase, but I think it would be better to come from all.
Sure. I mean, I can take a stab at it and then welcome Selena and other members of that group. It was based on feedback from the prior meeting of this group where the recommendations were starting to be put on paper. There were identified opportunities for additional clarification or context to build out these recommendations, make them more actionable, give more detail about potential next steps where appropriate. So it was just meant to add to their depth and clarity, while not deviating from the intent of what had already been put forward as recommendations generically by this group.
Great, thank you. Any comments on any of the recommendations as further drafted? Caitlin and then Ellen.
Thanks for recognizing my actual raised hand. I just wanted to reiterate what I put in the chat about the recommendation 2. I do feel like we are in agreement that we can just remove the part of the sentence on line 17 that references New Jersey, just because it's a reference to something that is as yet undefined. I know we did change the language a little bit to give some wiggle room, but I would feel more comfortable just taking that out. I also
period after Maine.
Yeah.
Okay.
I also just wanted to kind of get the larger group's feedback. We had tossed around a couple of different numbers about how big a dual use pilot program could be. I know I had suggested 50 megawatts at least. We had talked about how to kind of calculate that based on relative size of Maine and Massachusetts and New Jersey. But I know we didn't come to a full agreement or recommendation, so went with kind of like the lowest option, and just wondering if anyone else has feedback or would feel more comfortable kind of leaving a number out if we're not in agreement on how big the number should be.
Ellen, is your hand up in about this? No. Okay, then let's get reactions about that figure.
I would support leaving the number out without further data.
Is the figure you're asking about, Jody, 20 megawatts? Is that it?
Yes, yes. And you'll see Emily's note in the chat. Massachusetts has 11 megawatts of dual use, and it is not nearly enough to learn what we need to. She recommends at least 50. What are others' perspectives? Selena, go ahead. And
Feel
then
comfortable with the at least, and that gives the group that is tasked with defining the program, determining how to ensure that we are getting the information we need out of the research, but also that the cost of the program is reasonable. I hear you that a larger program would be beneficial, but I think without more details on how all of it will be funded, I'd prefer a smaller kind of bottom bar, and then growing it as it's clear that there are resources to do it and that there's a need to do it.
thank you. Eliza?
Just quickly to say, I don't have an opinion on the specific number, though I do think it's very important to do a number in the interest of creating actionable recommendations. And similar to Selena, having at least proceed, whatever that number is, really makes sense to me.
Emily, are you speaking to this point? Okay, go ahead, sorry.
I appreciate that we don't necessarily, maybe as a collective, feel comfortable putting a number, but having a number as small as 20, even though it says at least, I really feel that 20 is not nearly enough to have a pilot and understand what some of the implications are. That could be 4 projects, that could be just not enough. So I have concerns of leaving it at such a low number in there, but I understand that we're not necessarily here to, or going to feel comfortable recommending a number.
What if we switched it to removing the number but referencing that the size, that it be of a size sufficient to produce the desired information? Jeremy, go ahead. And then Matt.
I was just going to say, or just ask Emily, why do we know that 20 is not enough? And I'm not saying that it shouldn't be 50. I honestly just don't know the answer.
What we actually have on the ground in Massachusetts, that number 11, the diversity of projects is fairly limited in terms of being able to study different types of crop design and various sort of implications based upon the landscape. Coming from like a research background, it's not nearly enough to make some decent conclusions and recommendations.
What I'm going to ask before I take Nick is I want to make sure that we have sufficient time to cover any changes that you want to, any of the additional recommendations. So if any of you have a thought that you want to raise about another recommendation, could you put the recommendation number in the chat so that I can see how much more we're needing to cover in the time that we have remaining? And then while folks do that, I'll take Nick.
I think Matt was ahead of me.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Matt, go ahead.
Oh, you're such a gentleman. So yeah, just on the question of the program size, I think in Massachusetts, the dual use program is the most expensive of any of the sectors of the SMART program. So I would just watch that one. I don't think we should have an actual procurement. So I would say 0. And instead, my recommendation would be to pick a few research questions and work with the university ag extension program, or the ag program, and fund that to do some work. Like, we're funding some work through Unity College at one of our solar projects, just with a recurring grant, so that we can kind of ask some intelligent questions about pollinator friendly practices and those kinds of things, and then get the information, as Emily said, over time, 10-year research horizon, so that we can actually formulate some reasonable conclusions versus kind of doing it on a commercial basis, which then I think is just going to be ripe for discussion in the legislative process about the, see, look at the crazy costs of all this boutique solar that we're doing in the state, and not good for ratepayers, et cetera. You can follow the thread. So I think that would be my recommendation, is just to try to avoid that conversation with a bunch of hostile legislators. I would suggest, research is good. It taps into our university system, which is strong, and we've got some great questions here. Let's go ask them and get good data.
I'm seeing Nick. I'm going to take you next, Nick. Go ahead.
I took my hand down. Thanks.
I just want to make sure I understood your comment. You like Eliza's recommendation. Which one is that?
Okay, I'll make a comment. So because this is still pretty fresh in Maine, and Maine isn't Pennsylvania or New York or New Jersey or all those things, I think a change like Eliza had recommended, 20 to 50 megawatt, appreciating that's going to be 100 acres plus, probably. I don't know if Matt or anybody else can say the tranche of programs that are coming up are this scale, but if we build it to a size that's Maine for a pilot, great. If not, then a range that, as Eliza suggested, I think could be appropriate for this report.
And to clarify what Eliza recommended, suggested at least 20 megawatts to approximately 50 megawatts. How do you feel about that word change? I'm seeing a thumbs up. I'm seeing other thumbs up. There is a wide range of perspectives on this. We've just heard from Matt, who thinks that there shouldn't be any, not only should there not be any acreage referenced, there shouldn't be, this shouldn't be the approach. I do think, just to be candid, that the prior meeting's conversation about a dual use program has included the discussion about a pilot program on the ground. So that feels like kind of a new angle that's late in the process, that would have been more helpful to hear earlier on. If I put your comment aside for just a moment, Matt, not out of disrespect, but just out of thinking about what the past conversations have been, it would then come to a question of, should the language of at least 20 megawatts be retained as is? And I'm inclined to think that that may be the best solution that the rest of you can live with, because I'm not necessarily seeing consensus on 20 to 50. Is there anyone, recognizing Matt's point, are there any others who are not inclined to support Eliza's recommended change? All right, I'm seeing that everyone else can support it. Matt, does my logic hold any sway at all or not?
No, it does. It does. And I definitely appreciate the sort of drive toward consensus here. I just, to tie back to, I think the prior meetings, we did discuss the exorbitant costs of dual use as defined in Massachusetts, right? It's like effectively an unaffordable type of project, particularly given ratepayer considerations in Maine. So I do think you could look at Massachusetts, New Jersey, other examples. It's the most expensive type of project. It doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue it. I'm just suggesting that it be done in a way that where you refine the call it like the program size and the research questions that you want to, right? Like, I don't think we have a basis for sizing this program at all today. And until you sort of go figure out what answers, you know, what questions you want to have answered, it feels like we're just kind of skipping the most important part of this, which is the scoping piece of the work.
So I think what I was trying to.
That said, I'm happy to kind of go for it. You know, I just think,
Okay.
I think it's going to be a mess in the legislature, but and may jeopardize the quality of the good work that's been done here.
Okay, then I think what I'm hearing is that we change lines 27 to 28 to a range of 20 to 50, if I heard that correctly. And then we move on to recommendation
I'll
one.
just vocalize my opposition. I understand we're, you know, the majority of people agree, but I'll just vocalize my opposition. I don't think that's an appropriate change at this point. I think we agreed to 20. That's where we should stay. And it's not clear to me, again, without a further robust conversation, why that range is necessary.
Okay. My instinct is to leave it as it is, as drafted currently. Does anybody have great difficulty with that in order for us to move on to recommendation one? Okay, then let's do that. No change. Let's bounce back up to recommendation one. Is it Liza who wanted to make a comment about that? No, Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, I put it in the chat before some of the discussion between the 20 and 50, just a suggested change to recommendation one. I just think it's really important to name some of the trends that we're looking to identify through this clearinghouse, and also whose responsibility it is to be analyzing those trends. I just think we heard also in the public comment, there's just a lot of, you know, desire to know, you know, sort of what types of impacts we're seeing, if, you know, even if they're minimal, right? Just sort of knowing where we stand. And so I just really wanted to specify the types of trend data that we would hope to capture within this clearinghouse, and then who would be sort of providing that analysis and making sure that the recommendation included sort of additional resources or staff support for those relevant government bodies.
So Ellen, it is difficult because of how the chat works to be able to see exactly what the changes are, because it's long. So can you just hone in on what the changes are, or the addition?
Sure. It's really with the sentence that begins this information.
Can you bring us to line?
Oh, sorry.
The document itself.
Yes. If you line 10 under recommendation one.
Okay.
So I took out where applicable. So I just said this information should be used by DACF in conjunction with GEO to identify potential land use and natural resource impact trends, including the amount of agricultural land and the types of soils that are impacted by approved and constructed renewable energy projects, including solar projects. And then I changed the the sentence after that, which begins on line 12, because I was sort of including DACF in this process. And so I said GEO and DACF may need additional resources or staff support to implement this recommendation.
So the substantive change to this is, if you can just now summarize what you see.
Sure.
The substantive change is what?
Is to identify exactly what trends we're hoping to be able to identify through the collection of this data, and exactly whose responsibility it is to provide that analysis of those trends.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy, go ahead.
Is there something that happens at DACF or elsewhere where we are examining development pressures generally related to farmland? So in other words, are we only gathering information related to solar's perceived impact on farmland? What about residential subdivisions, other types of commercial development?
Sure, I can speak to that. MNAP and to a degree LMF, sorry, Maine, yeah, Lands for Maine Future, does have review with respect to trends. It is not being as fully acquainted with how and how often they do that. I don't want to overstate what it is that they compile or when they and what they do with that information. A very important disclaimer, though, is, you know, they are not regulatory in what they're doing. We are not a licensing agency when it comes to farmland development. Obviously, that would be, you know, akin to any type of development that would require DEP licensing. Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you. I think it just creates concern for me here. I feel like this feels like the implication is that there's a problem that is being presented by solar, and we are either ignoring or giving short shrift to other development pressures that create, conceivably, concerns and worries that I've heard from others raised in this group about what solar is doing to farmland. So it seems odd to me that we would say, let's make sure we've got this really deep, detailed clearinghouse of information that examines solar's pressures on farmland. And then we've got some other stuff that we do, but it's really not that detailed and it's not updated regularly and it doesn't appear to be communicated to anyone.
Eliza, go ahead.
Only to say that, you know, in conversations that I've had with folks from natural resource agencies, there is a real want to increase capacity on the part of natural resource agencies and other planning staff to get a fuller impression of development pressure across the state, regardless of what the type of development is. So while that specificity of data might not be there quite yet. I know, for instance, at the Land Use Planning Commission, they're looking to really get their record keeping in a much better place so that they can do this same type of analysis for the full scope of development that they're seeing within their jurisdiction. So this is not unique to solar.
With this addition, are there any more clarifying questions about what this suggestion is for added language? Selena.
Just around the language of interconnecting, can you clarify what phase of project development are you trying to capture with that term? Are you like final projects that are being built or proposed for the interconnection queue?
I think maybe final projects that are proposed to be built. I mean, it just seemed like part of this recommendation came out of the fact that in the beginning, right, of our discussions as a group, we really struggled with the projects that have been approved, not really being able to assess where exactly, what types of land they were being sited on. And there was just sort of a lack of information, and that sort of coupled with some of the, you know, questions and comments that came out of our discussion about, you know, how much sort of prime soils are being impacted, you know, and we have the Maine Audubon data, which is really fantastic, but, you know, I think that they have always stressed, right, that is based on projects that undergo site review, right, which is both over-inclusive and under-inclusive. And so it's really important, I think, for our own edification. I just think for as a state, as we're trying to create this balance, to understand, you know, what the trends are of approved projects that are going to move forward, not just projects that go through site law review.
Given these further descriptions, and I am looking at the time, And what I understand is that one of you would like to raise a minor change to 3 and possibly a minor change to recommendation 6. So I want to leave time for that. Are you supportive of the change that's been recommended? I need to see a thumbs up or not. Yeah, got you, Jeremy. Be more comfortable with language that said something like, the group acknowledges that development pressures from all sources should be considered and examined. Impression.
I did want to comment just quickly on the interconnection piece too. I mean, I don't know that it makes a whole lot of sense for us to be gathering data about projects that are in the interconnection queue versus projects that have received their permits. I mean, otherwise, if somebody said that they're going to put up a car dealership on the Appalachian Trail tomorrow, are we going to gather data on that? No, because the permitting process is going to bounce that project pretty quickly. So it seems like we need to create some screens if we're going to gather data that only examine real projects that are actually being built.
Thank you. I'm going to table this and move on to the other two so that we give so that we can hear what the changes are that are being recommended for recommendation 3. Ray, who suggested that one? Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's in line 4. I recommend changing the word could to the word should.
Are folks comfortable with that change? For example, such land should be treated as not subject to the withdrawal penalty if the farming operations continue to meet the farmland current use taxation requirements. Yep. Okay. And then, sorry?
I would prefer to leave it as could, not should.
Can you give a little bit more information about that?
Well, these are recommendations, right? So I guess that's just, I think we leave it as could. I don't see any need to put the word should in there.
Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I think should is a much clearer recommendation.
And so does your child. Let's move on from that for a moment. We'll come back to that. I want to hear about recommendation 6.
I think that's in reference to me.
Okay.
On line 28, I just thought the word welcome was maybe a little bit, I don't know, it seemed like a little bit of a strange word. I'm not sure what it means. I don't know if it should be like evaluate or that sort of thing, but.
Yeah, I think that was an intention that did not get incorporated. We'll work on that. I was here, so let me just go back to recommendation 3 because it's somewhat less complex than than recommendation 1. Can you live with should, Julianne? I'm hearing consensus with the rest from the rest of the group. I'm just wondering how important that word is to you.
I think this gets back to my earlier point of, is it consensus or is it majority?
Yeah, we're looking for consensus.
I guess I voiced my concern. I am not in consensus with that. So if the majority goes through, that's what happens, but.
Okay, then let's leave it as is. Let's go back to recommendation 1. I'm not hearing that we're going to be able to make the changes that are being recommended. If I'm misreading a possible path forward, then please, folks, let me know, but I'm not seeing it. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? Okay. All right, then we are at 11:59, and I think we've reached the conclusion of what we can accomplish as a group in 8 meetings. This is not the end of the conversation about this process, but this is the end of this Agricultural Solar Stakeholder Group. And I would imagine that it is unsatisfactory to many of you in terms of what could be accomplished in all directions. And frankly, that's often how processes work. It's certainly how every process that I have facilitated tends to work. Some you leave feeling better about than others, but generally you don't leave feeling like you've gotten everything that you really wanted. But I did want to just take the final moment to really sincerely thank all of you for your time. You've spent 8 meetings, 3 hours apiece, 24 hours, subgroup time, reviewing materials time. You've spent more than a week of a work week of your year on this topic. And I think collectively, you've brought to light a lot of scientific information, technical information that otherwise was, so scattered as to not be a sort of a coherent story. That has now been gathered in a final report. I have appreciated that you have been open to grappling with a really complicated issue. I've been very grateful that you've been willing to draft language that then could be debated. And I'm grateful as well to all the public members who have taken time over the last 8 months to weigh in, listen, and offer both oral comments and then written comments. And I do want to recognize Ethan and Tom for really diligently trying to capture what your sentiments were. And then I want to turn to Amanda, I'm sorry, not Amanda, Nancy and Selena to sort of see us out and thank them both as well for their guidance and leadership through this whole process.
Well, before I echo your comments, Jody, I also want to thank you for your fantastic leadership here in facilitating this group through this terrain. As today's meeting demonstrates, it really is a broad subject area with a lot of perspectives that all matter. And it really took someone with very capable experience and a skill set that I certainly do not have to make this a worthwhile exercise, and to have a product that I do firmly believe does reflect the good work of everybody here. So with that, thank you, Jody. And thank you as well to everybody for their time and participation. This is not the end, clearly. This was an important milestone. This report is good work, but we also have a lot more work to do within our respective organizations. So I look forward to continuing our dialogue and working with you in the future.
I don't think I can top that, Nancy. So thank you for everyone. I think it's, I'm trying to remember where we started and how much education that we've gone through. And I think we have made a lot of progress. So appreciate everyone's continued engagement. And I feel like this has been a very collaborative group. So I want to acknowledge that too. So.
Always open to feedback. If you want to email me separately, anything that you think that we could bring for future learning. I personally as well in facilitation, I always appreciate that. So otherwise, I hope you all have a great, happy holiday and hope to work with you in some way in the future. So take care.
Thank you.